The Cold War is going to have huge impacts on the United States at home. And because of time, I'm not going to have a full on lecture. In fact, it's going to be a very abbreviated lecture. But Cold War culture is fascinating. Of course, it all comes down to epic struggle in Rocky. You got the Rocky, the American hero with the American trunks, fighting Lenin in the Soviet Union. And if you haven't seen it, you should rent it because it's the most amazing movie ever. But you have tons. Rambo is a product of the Cold War. The Hunt for Red October, awesome film about the Cold War. Invasion USA. The aliens are metaphors for communist takeover. Red Dawn, epic 80s movie about communists taking over American soil. The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. All of these films are connected to this Cold War era. Doctor Strangelove is a classic about the atomic bomb. So you even have comic heroes such as Captain America. He goes from battling the Nazis to battling the communists in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. Now, the quick thing is there is a paranoia, a second Red Scare that occurs during the beginning stages of the Cold War. There's a ton of fear in this country, and the country is looking for answers. And the fear is partly justified because if you take a look at kind of some of the things that were going on, our former ally has suddenly now become our big enemy. Eastern Europe is occupied. Greece and Turkey are threatened. You have China falling to the communists in 1949. The Soviets get the bomb in 1949. North Korea attacks South Korea in 1950. So there's this fear, paranoia that develops, and you actually get the House of Un-American Activities Committee holding a series of hearings. Now, HUAC, as it was known, was around ever since 1938, and it becomes a tool during the Cold War of rooting out suspected communist sympathizers. And actually, it's not just HUAC, but President Truman. You have a very young Richard Nixon emerging during this time. And in 1947, you get Executive Order 9835 being passed in March of 1947. And basically, anybody who was considered a subversive in the government could be fired. And it established the Federal Employee Loyalty Program. If you were suspected of having dissenting ideas, even if you were someone who had political beliefs that were maybe not very popular, you could be dismissed from the government. Um, Problems with this, you could not efface your accuser. Very often, if you were accused, you were presumed to be guilty. And what ends up happening is in 1947, HUAC starts to hold hearings, public hearings, to expose alleged communist threats in American life. Now, the thing about this is these accusations of disloyalty were very often unfounded. So if you were accused, if you belonged to certain organizations, if you fought, for example, for civil rights, if you had leanings towards one side of the political spectrum, you could be ultimately accused and put before the House of Un-American Activities Committee. And one of the reasons why this hysteria begins is the U.S. had suffered setbacks. For example, receiving emergency action message, recommend alert 1, recommend alert 1. The loss of China to the communists in 1949. Baby, you dropped the bomb on me. Burn me out. That's my singing. Alright, so the Soviets dropped the bomb and the war in the 1950s. And another thing is it wasn't all just imaginary. There were spies that were discovered. And one of the things that they found out was that the Soviet Union was able to get the bomb a lot sooner than we thought because classified documents had been leaked. In fact, atomic secrets during World War II were handed over to the Soviet Union by spies in America. There was a Communist Party in the United States, had about 80,000 members, but the extent of that was unknown. And what ends up happening is people in the 1940s and 1950s, there is a real concern, but it becomes an hysteria. And they're looking for easy answers. They're looking for someone to blame. They're looking for some sort of reason to easily understand the world in which they are finding themselves in. And so what starts off as a couple of incidences of communist spies within the government, and I'm going to mention two of them in just a moment, turns into this witch hunt. They're looking for someone to blame. So what ends up happening is universities ban controversial speakers, magazines and bookstores are censored. Anybody who was considered to be critical of the government, for instance, labor unions, people in the civil rights movements, were suddenly now kind of cast with this cloud of suspicion over them. And this hysteria is fueled partly by real events. In 1948, a guy by the name of Whittaker Chambers testifies before the House of Un-American Activities Committee and reveals that he was a former Soviet agent, and Alger Hiss, who was a guy who had graduated from Harvard Law, was part of the New Deal, was at the Yalta Conference, was in the State Department, that he in fact was a communist spy. And Hiss denies it. He denies even knowing Chambers. Truman comes to Alger Hiss's defense. A lot of people say this is ridiculous. And it really looks like, Alger Hiss was telling the truth. And basically you have this situation where you have Whittaker Chambers, his testimony, versus Alger Hiss. A lot of people on the left, Roosevelt liberals, are questioning this. Richard Nixon kind of emerges during this scandal as one of the crusaders against Hiss. And it turns out that it does look like Alger Hiss, at the very least, was lying about knowing Whittaker Chambers. He committed perjury. He lied under oath. And it looks that Alger Hiss did in fact give secret State Department documents in the 1930s to the Soviet Union. And he is found guilty of perjury. In fact, he is sent to prison for 5 years. Now, the question becomes, well, for one, Nixon is emerging as this anti-communist Republican, big-time guy. Hiss goes to jail, but who else? Who else is in this plot? Who else is a communist? And what's important to understand is the Hiss case and the HUAC hearings heightened America's fears. There must be some sort of bigger plot here. It must be so much bigger than just this guy. Because how else could China fall to the communists? How else could the Soviets have gotten the bomb so quickly? And this unknown California congressman, you can go visit his house over somewhere near Yorba Linda, Orange County, something like that. It's about an hour away from downtown. Nixon rises to power, and you get this other figure emerging, Senator Joseph McCarthy. You get another kind of big old scandal. This couple, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were two individuals who were accused by this individual, a German-born scientist, Klaus Fuchs, that he was arrested by the British, and he was arrested for passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. And what ends up happening is during the kind of investigation, these two individuals are implicated. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. And they are accused of passing on atomic secrets as well. Here they are in their police lineup. They, of course, claim they are innocent of charges of espionage. There's a very famous trial. And ultimately, they are executed by the electric chair. And this hack occurs in 1953. Now, once again, both Hiss and Rosenbergs had claimed to be innocent. It appears that they were in fact lying, and this fuels this kind of suspicion. Who else is involved in this communist plot against America? And Joseph McCarthy kind of becomes this figure who leads this witch hunt in American life for communists. Now, if you've read the book The Crucible, this book, which was written in the 50s, is a, I don't know the English term, so someone email Mr. Apollo. But basically, it is an analogy. I don't know. But the Salem witch trials, this kind of accusing, looking for easy answers, is very similar to what is occurring in the 1950s. The difference probably is there were no witches at all. There were a few communists within the government. Senator Joseph McCarthy starts leading a series of hearings. He does it partly because of political reasons. He wants to get reelected. What better way than to say everyone else is weak on communists? He says he's going to name names. He actually, claims that he has all this evidence against all these people within the government. Starts flinging out accusations left and right. Basically accusing tons of people of disloyalty. People even within the Truman administration, for example, George Marshall, the guy who came up with the freaking Marshall Plan, he is accused. He talks about the fact that Douglas MacArthur, the general, was fired, was a communist victory, and creates a lot of fear in the United States. This guy is politically very, very influential because if you were on one of these lists, if you were one of these people who were accused, your life would be ruined. You would be fired, you would be, in some cases, convicted. And a lot of what ends up happening is eventually, and I'm quickly simplifying everything here, it turns out that he really had no evidence in many cases. In many cases, he was waving his laundry list in front of the committees or other pieces of paper. And you could see that in this political cartoon. McCarthy is eventually going to fade away. But Democrats and Republicans were terrified of him. No one wanted to take him on. Dwight D. Eisenhower, when he's elected in 1952, a Republican, a general, a guy who led NATO, D-Day, didn't want to take him on because you don't want to be accused of being soft on communism. And here you could see Dwight Eisenhower have this look of fear when confronted by MacArthur. And the causes of McCarthyism, as I've already stated, the atomic bomb, the Korean War is not going very well. It ends in a stalemate. The American people want to know why. And there's a lot to gain by calling your opponent weak, soft on communists. It's very easy to say, look, we're not winning the Cold War. We're losing the Cold War. It's very politically advantageous to accuse the other side of being soft or weak. Same thing's being done today in politics with regard to terrorism or other issues. You accuse your opponent, you simplify it, they're winning, we're losing. The effects are very important. Many Americans are forced to undergo loyalty oaths. Many people lose their jobs. Labor activism declines because you don't want to be associated with any kind of radical movement. Many people, it has a chilling effect on politics. You don't want to speak out on certain issues. And really, McCarthyism has a bad name, and it should. It's just basically charging people without any kind of evidence and this type of thing. Eventually, in the next chapter, you'll see he will be censured, which is a big deal in the Senate because he goes too far. He starts accusing people in the army of communist sympathies, and there's a famous exchange that's on TV. Have you no sense of decency, sir? And McCarthy will fade away a drunk and he'll die. But that's later. Just kind of one more thing. There is the infamous Hollywood 10 that the communists had taken over Hollywood and had been spreading America with propaganda. And basically, these Hollywood 10, there were a group of writers and producers and other figures within the industry, refused to testify. They refuse to answer questions. They refuse to name names. And that's one of the other things. If you were called before HUAC and you refuse to say anything, you must be guilty. So very often the way many people would deflect their own accusation is, oh, well, I'm not a communist, but so-and-so is. Um, Many of them, the Hollywood 10, the famous Hollywood 10, were jailed for contempt. They were also blacklisted. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, they sacrificed their careers in many cases to take a stand against what they felt was uh, a basic horrible thing. McCarthy, here he is eventually getting tangled in his own web. You'll see that in the next chapter. Congress passes the McCarran Internal Security Act, required all communist associations to register with the blah, 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 blah. You got that. And next quick whack PowerPoint will be Harry at home.